The boardroom floor at Renner Tower fell silent. 200 employees stood shoulder to shoulder under fluorescent light, watching Clare Doyle point a finger across the room. "You don't get to set the schedule here," she said, her voice carrying to the back wall. "You can't quit, so do what I said." Grant Whitfield stood near the loading doors, hard hat under one arm, dust still on his boots from the sub-basement. He looked at her for exactly 3 seconds. Then he set the hard hat on the folding table in front of him, turned, and walked out. No one followed him. "Before you find out why he didn't say a word, would you have walked out, or stayed and argued back? Keep that answer in mind. It matters later." Grant didn't talk on the drive home. Dayton slid past the truck windows, brick storefronts, a hardware store with a faded sign, the overpass where the highway crossed Route 4. He kept both hands on the wheel and let the radio hum low, something on the classic rock station he didn't quite recognize. Emma was waiting at the curb outside Jefferson Elementary, backpack slung over one shoulder, talking to a friend. She climbed in, dropped her bag at her feet, and studied his face the way only an 8-year-old could direct, unfiltered, missing nothing. "You look mad," she said. "I'm not mad. You look like you're not mad on purpose." He almost smiled. Almost. Long day at work. She let it go the way kids do, moving on to the thing that actually mattered to her, a drawing she'd made in art class, a lopsided sun over a house with too many windows. She held it up between the seats. He glanced at it at a red light and told her it was good, and meant it. At home, she set the table without being asked. 3 plates out of habit, even though it had been 4 years since there'd been a third person to fill the gap. Neither of them mentioned it. They never did directly. Some things lived in the house without needing to be spoken. After dinner, Emma pulled a photograph from the drawer in the hallway table. Her mother, 26 years old, laughing at something off camera, dark hair caught mid-turn in a gust of wind. She asked, the way she sometimes did, what her mother's voice had sounded like. Grant told her, the same answer he always gave, careful and warm, the kind of memory that didn't hurt to hand over. Later, after Emma was asleep, Grant sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. A memory surfaced unbidden, not the photograph in the drawer, but an older one, buried somewhere in a box in the garage. Him at 27 in a hard hat and a collared shirt, standing on scaffolding 20 stories up, grinning like a man who didn't yet know what he'd lose. He put it out of his mind. The phone rang. Nora Pemberton. "You walked out," she said, not a question. "I did." Grant. A pause, the sound of a door closing on her end, her voice dropping lower. "She doesn't know who you are, but if that crack in the sub-basement is what I think it is, this isn't about pride anymore. I know what it is." "Then tell her. It's not my job to fix her mistakes." He kept his voice even, no heat in it, just a wall he'd built a long time ago and had no interest in tearing down for anyone. "I told corporate what I found. I put it in writing. If nobody wants to read it, that's not on me." Nora was quiet a moment. "You could still lose that building. It's not my building anymore." He said it like a fact, not like something he believed all the way down. After he hung up, he sat a long while in the dark kitchen, looking at nothing, before he finally went to check on Emma, straighten her blanket, and turn off the hall light. He stood in her doorway longer than he needed to. The nightlight threw a small circle of yellow onto the carpet, and Emma slept the way she always had, one arm flung above her head, blanket kicked halfway off despite the cold. He thought about the 27-year-old man in that old photograph, the one who used to believe a building was only as good as the math behind it. Nothing more complicated than that. He didn't know that man anymore, not entirely. But some nights, standing in doorways like this one, he came close enough to recognize the outline. The morning after Grant walked out, the sub-basement of Renner Tower was crawling with people who hadn't been down there in years. An engineer named Priya Anand, 29, 3 years into the job and sharper than most people gave her credit for, had been the one to spotted hairline cracking along a support column near the east stairwell, spreading faster than it should have for a building only 22 years old. She wasn't convinced it was normal settling. She wanted the original structural files, the ones from the building's last major retrofit, 12 years back, before the current ownership had consolidated its early engineering records into one archive. The archive room smelled like dust and toner. It took her 40 minutes to find the right box, and another 20 to find the right folder inside it. But when she did, she laid the blueprints out across a folding table, and felt something shift in her chest. Every stamped page, every calculation, every load-bearing diagram for the water and safety systems beneath Renner Tower carried the same name in the bottom corner next to a still valid engineering license number, Grant A. Whitfield, engineer of record. She sat with that for a long moment, then picked up the folder and went looking for someone who needed to see it. Claire was in her office on the 18th floor, coffee going cold on her desk, half listening to Marcus Feld explain again why the maintenance department's delays were a liability the board wouldn't tolerate much longer. She'd already replayed the scene from the day before a dozen times in her head, the way the room had gone silent, the way the maintenance man had simply picked up his hard hat and walked out rather than argue with her. It had bothered her more than she wanted to admit. Priya knocked, folder in hand, and didn't wait to be invited before she set it open on the desk. "You need to see this." Claire looked down at the name. She looked up at Priya. "This is current maintenance staff? Grant Whitfield." "Yes. He's been with the company 8 years, but the license goes back further than that." Priya hesitated. "He designed the load system that's holding up half this building. He's the one you called out yesterday." Claire didn't say anything for a while. She picked up the top page, ran a finger along the margin where a younger hand had signed off on calculations that had, by every account, kept this tower standing through 2 decades of Ohio winters and 1 bad flood. She thought about the way he'd looked at her before he walked out. Not angry, not wounded, just finished. "Does he know we found this?" "No. Keep it that way for now." Claire folded the blueprint closed, set it carefully on the corner of her desk, and didn't touch it again for the rest of the day. But she didn't file it away either. She left it exactly where she could see it, a reminder sitting in the corner of her vision every time she looked up, refusing to let her forget what she'd done in front of 200 people. That evening, she left the office earlier than usual, drove 20 minutes to a street of modest houses she'd never had reason to visit, and parked across from a small brick home with a porch light already on. She sat there with the folder on the passenger seat, hand on the door handle, and didn't get out. Would you have knocked or driven away? Some doors are heavier than they look. Stick around, because Claire is about to find out just how much. She knocked. It took a moment before the porch light brightened and the door opened. Grant stood there in a gray t-shirt, sleeves rolled, dish towel still in one hand. He didn't look surprised so much as unreadable, the same flat calm he'd worn walking out of the boardroom. "Miss Doyle, Claire is fine." He didn't invite her in, not yet. He stepped out onto the porch instead, pulling the door mostly closed behind him. "It's late for a site visit." "This isn't about the site." She held up the folder, and something in his face changed, just briefly, a flicker before the wall came back down. "I know who you are. I know what you built. That was a long time ago. You didn't think it mattered? Telling someone that before they call you out in front of the entire company, you didn't ask." His voice wasn't sharp, just tired. "You told me what to do and assumed I'd fall in line because I needed the paycheck. I didn't think my resume was the part worth discussing." Claire absorbed that. It landed harder than she expected. The report said maintenance was stalling the inspection sign-off. Marcus said your team was the bottleneck. "I didn't sign off because there's a discharge line under the east stairwell that's been rerouted from the original schematic, and it's sitting about 8 feet from the crack your engineer found this morning. I flagged it 3 weeks ago. Nobody acted on it, so I wasn't putting my name on a safety report I didn't believe." The words sat between them. Claire realized, with a discomfort she didn't enjoy, that this was the first time she'd heard this version of events not filtered through Marcus, not summarized in a memo, but directly, plainly, from the person who'd actually been standing in that sub-basement. Before she could answer, the door behind Grant cracked open, and a small face appeared in the gap, brown-eyed, curious, hair still damp from a bath. Emma studied Claire with the frank interest of an 8-year-old encountering something new. "Who's that?" "Someone from my work, Bug. Go finish brushing your teeth." Emma didn't move right away. She looked between the two adults, decided there was nothing more interesting happening, and disappeared back inside. The moment broke something, and the tension on the porch not resolved it, just softened its edges. "I should go," Claire said. "Probably." She turned to leave, then stopped at the top of the steps and reached into her coat pocket for a card she'd written on in the car. hesitating twice before finally deciding to hand it over. "I need to know what's actually happening in that building, not the version that makes me look competent to the board. The truth." Grant took the card, glanced at it, a handwritten line beneath her printed name and title. He didn't read it aloud. He just folded it once and put it in his back pocket. "I'll think about it," he said, which was as close to a yes as she was going to get that night. Claire walked back to her car slower than she'd walked up to the house. She sat behind the wheel for a minute without starting the engine, watching the porch light through the windshield, the small shape of the drawing Emma had left on the steps still visible through the screen door. She thought about the board meeting scheduled for the following week, the numbers she'd need to present, the version of herself she'd have to be in that room. None of it felt as urgent, sitting there, as the plain fact that a man 20 feet away had spent 3 weeks protecting a building full of strangers while she'd spent that same time deciding he wasn't worth listening to. She started the car and drove home in silence, radio off, replaying his voice the whole way. He thought about it for 2 days. What decided it wasn't Claire? Not directly, it was the image of that discharge line sitting 8 feet from a spreading crack, and the fact that nobody with the authority to fix it seemed to understand what they were looking at. Grant had spent enough of his life walking away from things he couldn't fix. He wasn't in the habit of walking away from things he could. He called the front office Wednesday morning and told them he'd meet the inspection team in the sub-basement at 10. Claire was already there when he arrived, standing at the base of the stairwell in work boots that still had the store crease in them, a hard hat under her arm like she wasn't quite sure how to hold it. She didn't say much when he walked in, just nodded, the way you'd greet someone whose time you didn't want to waste. They worked well together, which surprised neither of them and both of them at once. Grant traced the discharge line with a flashlight, explained load distribution in plain terms she didn't need dumbed down, and she asked sharp, specific questions that told him she'd actually read the reports before showing up. There was a rhythm to it: question, answer, correction, agreement, that had nothing to do with the boardroom, and everything to do with two people who both, in different ways, cared whether this building stayed standing. Marcus found them there an hour in. He came down the stairwell with his tie loosened, the picture of a man who'd rushed but didn't want it to look that way. "I heard maintenance was called back in," he said, directing it at Claire, not Grant, as though Grant weren't standing 3 feet away. "I'd have appreciated a heads up before we brought outside opinions into a structural review." "He's not outside," Claire said. "He's the engineer of record on this system." Something moved behind Marcus's eyes. Fast and gone. 12 years ago. Standards change. I'd feel more comfortable with someone current. "I'll take his read over a spreadsheet," Claire said, flat, final, and turned back to the discharge line as though the conversation were over. Marcus stood there a beat longer than the moment called for, then said something about needing her upstairs for the board deck, and left the way he'd come, footsteps a little too quick on the stairs. Grant watched him go, filing something away without comment. "You didn't have to do that," he said once Marcus was gone. "Do what?" "Take my side." In front of him, Claire crouched by the discharge line, running a gloved hand along the pipe's cold surface, not looking up right away. "I spent 3 years trying to prove I deserved this job. I'm not going to start being wrong about who deserves to be listened to, just because it's inconvenient." He didn't have an answer for that. He just crouched down beside her and kept working, and if either of them noticed how close their shoulders had gotten in the process, neither said anything about it. They stayed down there past noon, past the point where the inspection team had already logged what they needed and moved on to the next floor. Claire held the flashlight while Grant traced conduit through a gap in the drywall. And somewhere in the quiet back and forth of measurements and confirmations, the conversation drifted somewhere looser, not personal exactly, but not strictly business either. She asked him how long he'd lived in Dayton. He asked her if she'd grown up here too, in the company, in her father's shadow, and she answered honestly, without the polish she usually reserved for that question. Neither of them noticed how much time had passed until a security guard leaned into the stairwell to tell them the building was closing for the evening. The discharge line told its own story once Grant traced it back far enough. It wasn't corrosion. It wasn't age. Somebody had rerouted it roughly 6 months earlier, a shortcut that saved money on material but ran the pipe directly against a load-bearing seam it was never supposed to touch. Water pressure, temperature swings, 22 floors of weight pressing down. It was only a matter of time before that seam gave. Grant didn't say what he was thinking out loud, not yet. He wanted more than a hunch before he pointed a finger at anyone, especially with Marcus already circling. He photographed the reroute from 3 angles, pulled the work order number stamped faintly on a nearby junction box, and said nothing to Claire beyond confirming what she already suspected: the crack wasn't age. It was recent. It was avoidable. That evening, away from the tower entirely, Claire found herself outside Jefferson Elementary at pickup time, ostensibly there to review a community outreach proposal with the school's principal, though she could have handled it over email just as easily. She told herself that. She didn't entirely believe it. Emma spotted her first, backpack half on, waving with the easy confidence of a kid who didn't know yet that adults weren't always as friendly as they looked. "Your dad's work friend." Something like that. Emma held out a folded piece of paper, slightly creased from being carried in a pocket all day. "I made this in art. It's supposed to be a building, but Miss Carver said it looks more like a castle. I think castles are cooler anyway." Claire unfolded it. Crayon towers in uneven shades of gray, a lopsided sun in the corner, and unmistakably a small figure in a hard hat standing at the base, waving up at the windows. She felt something catch in her chest that she wasn't prepared for. "Can I keep this?" Emma shrugged, already looking past her toward the pickup line. "Sure. I got tons more at home." Grant arrived a moment later, and if he was surprised to find Claire crouched on the sidewalk holding his daughter's drawing like it mattered, he didn't show it beyond a slight pause in his step. Claire stood, tucked the paper carefully into her bag, and said something about the outreach proposal that was technically true. Grant let her have the cover story. He didn't call her on it, but driving home that night, he found himself thinking about the way Claire had looked at Emma's drawing. Not polite interest, not the practiced warmth of someone managing an image, but something unguarded, almost startled by its own softness. He didn't know what to do with that thought, so he set it aside, the way he set aside most things that threatened to matter too much too fast. Across town, in a corner office with the blinds drawn, Marcus Feld sat with his phone pressed to his ear, voice low. "Phase 2 starts Monday," he said. "Before the shareholder meeting, she won't see it coming." He hung up before anyone could ask him what he meant. Nobody in that building knew yet what Phase 2 involved, only that Marcus had spent the better part of a week meeting behind closed doors with people from outside the company, men in suits nobody recognized, folders that never made it onto any shared calendar. Whatever it was built to move fast and leave no clean trail back to the man setting it in motion. He had done this kind of thing before, quietly, patiently, and it had always worked. He had no reason yet to believe this time would be any different. Nora Pemberton had worked at Doyle Renner for 19 years, long enough to have carried more secrets through that building than anyone still on the payroll. She'd kept most of them out of loyalty, a few out of necessity, and exactly one Grant's out of a signed agreement she'd never once regretted honoring. But there was a difference between keeping a good man's past private and staying quiet while someone dismantled a woman she'd watched grow into her job the hard way. Nora had noticed things over the past 6 months. A change order that didn't match the budget she'd filed. A vendor invoice routed through Marcus's assistant instead of procurement. An email thread deleted from the shared drive but still sitting, forgotten, in an old backup folder she happened to have access to because nobody had ever bothered to revoke it. She read it twice before she printed it. Marcus Feld, 6 months earlier, to a contractor named Dale Sutton. Reroute the discharge line, cut the material cost, don't flag it through structural review. And in a second email, weeks later, to himself, almost like a note he never meant anyone to find if maintenance stalls the sign-off, it puts pressure on Claire before the shareholder meeting. Either she looks incompetent for missing it, or she looks weak for depending on him to catch it. Either way, the board starts asking questions about her judgment. Nora sat with the printed pages for a full day before she made a decision. Then she asked for 15 minutes on Claire's calendar, closed the office door behind her, and didn't sit down before she started talking. "I should have said something sooner," she said. "I have a reason I didn't, and it's not a good enough one anymore." Claire read the emails twice, the way Nora had, her face going through something complicated disbelief, then a colder kind of understanding, then something that looked almost like grief for the version of the last 6 months she'd believed in. He built this. Claire said quietly. Not really to Nora. The whole timeline. The delay. Grant's report. My own reaction in that boardroom. He built it so I'd hand him the reason to replace me. I believe so, yes. Claire sat with her hands flat on the desk for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone. Grant answered on the second ring. Out on a walk with Emma, the sound of a dog barking somewhere behind him. I need to see you, Claire said. Tonight, if you can. He met her an hour later at a diner 2 blocks from the tower. Neutral ground. The kind of place neither of them would run into anyone from work. She slid the printed emails across the table without preamble. He read them slowly, jaw tightening by the second line. He used my report to hurt you, Grant said when he finished. Not just to cover for the pipe. He wanted me to look unreliable so you'd look unreliable for trusting a maintenance guy over him. Yes. And it worked. For a while. Claire looked at him. Something raw in her expression she hadn't planned on showing. I stood in front of 200 people and humiliated the one person who actually told me the truth, because I believed the person who was lying to me. She exhaled, unsteady. I don't know how to fix that. You don't fix it, Grant said, quieter now. You just stop doing it again. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was the first thing that had passed between them that felt like the beginning of trust instead of the careful negotiation of it. They built the case over the next 4 days, working most evenings at Grant's kitchen table after Emma went to bed. Papers spread between coffee mugs, neither of them finished. Claire brought financial records and board correspondence. Grant brought engineering language translated into terms a room full of shareholders could actually follow, plain, exact, undeniable. Nora fed them what she could without exposing herself before the right moment, careful, methodical, a woman who'd waited 19 years to be this useful and intended to get it right. Marcus felt the ground shifting before he understood exactly why. He cornered Grant in the parking garage on a Thursday evening, waiting by his truck with the kind of stillness that wasn't patience so much as control held tightly in place. You should think carefully about what you're about to do, Marcus said. Careers end over less than what you're planning to say in that meeting. I'm aware. You walked away from all this once already. Nobody would blame you for doing it again. Go back to fixing leaky faucets and picking your kid up from school. Nobody has to know you were ever anything else. Grant's expression didn't change, but something in his voice went very still. You brought my family into this because you've got nothing left to threaten me with about the building. That tells me everything I need to know about how scared you are. Marcus's jaw tightened. Your wife's accident made the local paper. 4 years ago. I could make sure people remember exactly why you really left engineering. Grief does strange things to a man's judgment. Maybe the board should wonder if it still does. For a moment, Grant said nothing at all, and the silence had weight to it, the kind that made men reconsider what they'd just said. Then he stepped past Marcus, unlocked his truck, and spoke without turning around. I'm testifying Monday. Not for Claire. For every person who works in that building and doesn't know the floor under them was compromised to protect your bonus. He got in, started the engine. You can threaten whatever you want. It doesn't change the math on that pipe. He drove home with his hands tight on the wheel and didn't tell Claire about the conversation until much later that night, after Emma was asleep and the two of them sat on his porch steps in the cooling dark, the whole neighborhood gone quiet around them. He mentioned Rachel, Grant said finally, using his late wife's name for the first time in Claire's presence. Tried to use her to scare me off. Claire's expression didn't perform sympathy. It just held something steady and quiet, the kind of listening that didn't need to fill the silence with reassurance. I'm sorry he did that. I've had worse people say worse things. He looked out at the dark street. It didn't work. I wanted you to know that. Not because I need credit, because I don't want you thinking I'm doing this halfway. I don't think that. She was quiet a moment. I think you're the only person in this whole mess who's never once done anything halfway. Neither of them said anything else for a while. The porch light buzzed faintly overhead, moths circling it, and between them sat something unnamed but no longer avoided, not spoken aloud, not yet, but present all the same. The emergency shareholder meeting convened Monday morning in a conference room on the top floor. Glass walls looking out over a gray Dayton sky. Board members filed in with coffee and unease, aware something significant was about to happen without knowing exactly what. Claire opened the meeting herself. No notes. her voice steady in a way that surprised even her. She laid out the timeline plainly, the rerouted discharge line, the falsified urgency behind the inspection delay, the deliberate framing of maintenance staff to manufacture a crisis. Then she introduced Grant, not as a maintenance technician, but by the title that had been buried in a file cabinet for over a decade. Engineer of record for this building's original safety systems, she said. The man I publicly reprimanded 3 weeks ago for delaying a sign-off he was right to refuse. Grant walked the board through the technical findings without embellishment, photographs of the reroute, the load calculations. The timeline matched against Marcus's own emails, which Nora, seated near the back of the room, confirmed under direct questioning with a steadiness that surprised no one who knew her. Marcus tried, briefly, to reframe it cost efficiency, a miscommunication with the contractor. Nothing malicious, but the second email, the one about pressure and the shareholder meeting, left no room for a version of events where his intentions were anything but exactly what they looked like. The vote to suspend him pending full review passed within the hour, unanimous, with 2 board members not even waiting for the second reading of the motion before raising their hands. When it was over, Claire didn't sit back down right away. She stood at the head of the table and looked out at the room, and when she spoke again, it wasn't in the tone she used for board business. 3 weeks ago, I stood in a room with 200 employees and humiliated a man for something he didn't do because I trusted the wrong person's version of events. I owe him more than an apology, but I'll start with one anyway. She looked at Grant, not performing it, just saying it. I was wrong. Publicly. And I should have listened before I ever raised my voice. The room was quiet in a different way than it had been 3 weeks earlier. Not the silence of 200 people watching someone walk away, but something closer to respect settling into place where it hadn't been before. Grant didn't say much in response. He didn't need to. A small nod was enough, and it was enough for Claire, too. Afterward, board members lingered longer than usual, some of them crossing the room to shake Grant's hand, in a few asking questions about the retrofit work he'd done 12 years earlier, as though seeing him clearly for the first time. Priya caught his eye from across the room and gave him a small, satisfied nod of her own, the engineer, who'd started the whole chain of events by refusing to accept a crack as ordinary. Nora stayed near the back until the room had mostly emptied, then walked over and squeezed Grant's arm once, briefly, the closest thing to an apology either of them needed to put into words. That evening, back home, Emma sat cross-legged on the kitchen floor with a coloring book while Grant made dinner, the radio playing low the way it always did. She looked up at him with the particular directness she reserved for the questions that mattered most to her. "Is she your friend? The lady from work?" Grant paused, spatula in hand, and found he didn't have a quick answer ready. He just smiled, the kind that said more than words would have, and told her to go wash up for dinner. Emma didn't push, but she smiled too, like she already knew something he hadn't said out loud yet. Claire came to the house again 2 weeks later, this time in daylight, this time without a folder full of evidence to justify the visit. Grant was in the driveway, fixing the chain on Emma's bicycle, when her car pulled up. He didn't stop working right away, just glanced up long enough to register who it was before going back to the chain. "I've got a proposal for you," Claire said, standing at the edge of the driveway like she wasn't sure she'd earned the right to walk further in. Director of Structural Engineering, full authority over safety systems across the portfolio. "Whatever salary it takes to make it worth your while." Grant sat back on his heels. "That's a big jump from replacing gutters." "I'm not asking you to fix gutters anymore." She paused. "I'm asking, not telling. I know there's a difference now, and I know I owe you that difference for the rest of however long we work together." He looked at her for a long moment, weighing something that wasn't really about the job at all. "I left that world once because I couldn't be both the guy who works 80-hour weeks, chasing certifications, and the guy who's home for dinner every night. I'm not walking back into a version of my life that costs me that again." "Then we build a version that doesn't." Claire's voice was steady, certain in a way that hadn't been performative in a long time. "You set the terms, hours, travel, whatever it takes. I'm not interested in the version of you that isn't home for dinner. I've seen what that dinner table means to you." Something in Grant's chest loosened, just slightly, at that. He didn't answer right away. He finished tightening the bicycle chain instead, spun the pedal once to test it, and stood, wiping grease from his hands onto a rag from his back pocket. "I need some time," he said. Not because I'm saying no. Take it. He walked her partway up the block afterward, an unplanned thing neither of them mentioned out loud, past a neighbor's overgrown hedge and the corner where the streetlight had been flickering for weeks. Later that evening, after Emma had gone in for the night, the two of them ended up on the roof access of Renner Tower instead, an excuse about checking a ventilation reading that neither of them fully believed. The city spread out below them, gray rooftops and orange streetlights, the river cutting a dark line through the middle of it all. Neither of them said much. There wasn't the same distance between them there'd been on that porch weeks earlier, not physically, not in any other way either. They stood close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, watching the lights of a city that had, in its own quiet way, brought them here. Neither of them reached for the other's hand, not yet, but neither of them stepped away either. "You know," Claire said eventually, breaking the quiet without looking away from the skyline, "the day you walked out of that meeting, I told myself you were being difficult. It took me longer than it should have to understand you were the only person in that room being honest. I wasn't trying to make a point. I know. That's what made it land." She glanced at him then, the city lights catching the side of her face. "Most people who want something from me know how to ask for it. You didn't ask for anything, you just left. I've been thinking about that ever since." Grant didn't answer right away. The wind moved through the rooftop vents somewhere behind them, a low mechanical hum under the quiet. "I wasn't trying to leave you," he said finally. "I was trying to leave the version of that room where nobody was listening." Turns out those weren't the same thing. Claire didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. The two of them stood there a while longer, the city humming below, until the cold finally pushed them both back toward the stairwell door. Grant said yes 3 days later, over the phone, standing in his kitchen while Emma did homework at the table behind him. Claire didn't say much beyond "thank you," but the relief in her voice carried further than any longer sentence would have. His first week in the new role, he asked for one condition in writing, non-negotiable: home by 5:30 every day that didn't involve an active emergency. Claire agreed before he'd even finished the sentence. The transition happened quietly, none of the fanfare that might have surrounded someone else's promotion. Grant preferred it that way, and Claire, to her credit, understood without needing it explained. A small gathering in the break room, coffee, and a sheet cake someone had ordered last minute. Nora standing near the back with the kind of proud, quiet smile that comes from having waited a long time to see something set right. Marcus's name came up exactly once that week, in a closed-door meeting about the terms of his departure, and then not again. The building moved on the way buildings do, floor by floor, day by day, the crack in the sub-basement long since repaired and inspected twice over for good measure. Grant and Claire settled into something that had no clean label yet. Not officially, not out loud long conversations, that started as project updates and ended somewhere else entirely, lunches that stopped needing an agenda, the easy quiet of two people who no longer measured every word before saying it. Emma noticed first, the way kids notice everything, before adults are ready to admit it. On a Saturday evening in late autumn, Claire came to dinner, an actual invitation this time. No reports involved, no drawings smoothing over an awkward pause. Emma answered the door before Grant could, delighted, already talking before Claire had both feet inside. "We're having spaghetti. Dad always burns the garlic bread a little, but it's still good." "I heard that," Grant called from the kitchen. Claire laughed. The sound easy and unguarded, in a way it rarely had been in that building on the 18th floor. She hung her coat by the door, next to Grant's jacket and Emma's backpack, in a house that had learned, slowly and without ceremony, how to make room for her. Dinner was simple spaghetti, garlic bread with one burnt corner. Grant tried and failed to hide, Emma narrating an elaborate story about a classmate's science project that had nothing to do with anything and everything to do with the ordinary happiness of the evening. Claire listened to all of it like it mattered, because it did. Later, after Emma had gone up to bed, Grant and Claire sat on the back porch with the last of the wine, the yard dark and quiet around them, crickets somewhere in the grass. Neither of them said anything important. They didn't need to. At some point, without either of them deciding to, Claire's hand found his on the armrest between their chairs, and he didn't pull away. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a declaration. It was just two people who'd spent months learning how to trust each other in daylight, finally letting that trust sit quietly beside them in the dark. unremarked upon, exactly where it belonged. Neither of them had been looking for this, not the CEO who once dared him to stay, nor the man who had once built the very ground she stood on. But some things aren't found by looking, they're found by staying.